dear students, to the massive open online course on international economics. In today's module, we are going to talk about trade as an engine of growth and the prospects of trade in the coming decades. In this module, we are going to speak about the link between trade growth and the long-term growth prospects. We would also like to explore the prospects for trade growth in the coming decades. Furthermore, we would like to understand the magnitude of the concept called trade costs and also try to examine its correlates and identify the policies that can help to reduce the trading costs. Now, global trade has been powered by trade liberalization and falling transport costs. And this historically has been an important engine of growth for many of the countries in the world. And not only an important engine of growth, but also an important engine for productivity growth. In recent decades, it has helped to lift around 1 billion people out of poverty. And many developing countries has also been integrated into the world economy due to the influence of international trade. Empirical studies indicates that a 1 percentage point of GDP increase in trade openness has lifted per capita income by around 0.2 percentage points. And this large part of a gain in trade can be attributed to the expansion of the global value chain. Participation in the global value chain generally generates efficiency gains, which helps in supporting the transfer of knowledge, capital, and other inputs across countries. And in this process, they help to boost productivity. And we have also to keep in mind that global value chain integration has also been associated with reduced vulnerability of economic activity and also to domestic shocks, although it generally leads to increased sensitivity to the external shocks. In the past decade and a half, global trade growth has slowed. This mainly is the result of global value chains which has matured, investment weaknesses which has weighed on goods trade, and trade tensions has emerged in many of the major economies of the world. As a result, the growth of global trade in goods and services, if we take the year that is from 2011 to 2019, it was just as fast as the rise in global trades in goods or in output. On the other hand, the global trade in goods and services during 1990 to 2011 was twice as fast as the global output growth. So if we try to look into the fact as the relation between global output growth and global trade, we find that if we look at the time period 1990 to 2011, the global trade had outpaced the global output growth by about twice the numbers, while if we look from the period just before the pandemic, COVID pandemic, that is from 2011 to 2019, we find that global trade in goods is just equal to the global trade in the global output growth rate. This is something that we need to ponder upon. COVID-19 pandemic, global trade was hit particularly hard. It fell by around 16 percentage points in the second quarter of 2020. The subsequent rebound of global trade was swift enough. However, if you look only at the global goods trade, the rebound was really swift. In fact, it was faster than the rebound of trade that occurred after the global financial crisis of 2007-2009. In 2021, the global trade slowed down again. It was disrupted by lockdowns and closures in the midst of the new COVID-19 outbreak and the emergence of significant supply chain strains in a number of sectors in the economy. And a further blow to supply chains and trade was dealt by Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which dislocated the global commodity markets and manufacturing processes that rely on specialized inputs from Russia or from Ukraine. So, in the absence of any major policy effort, trade growth is likely to weaken further over the remaining of the 2020s. And this mainly will be because of the prospect of a slower output growth and the fact that certain key structural factors that had been supporting rapid trade expansion in the past decades have largely run their course or have largely exhausted their steam. Now, although supply chains have been remarkably resilient given the magnitude of the recent shocks in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic and also in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this could accelerate changes in supply chains that were already underway, including by further insourcing or regionalizing the production networks and also due to increasing digitalization. Hence, a contraction of supply chain may lower the output elasticity of trade further, continuing a process that has been underway since 2010. So from 2010, what we have basically observed is that there has been a lowering of the output elasticity of trade, and that has really taken its course in the 2020s. Multinational corporations which are operating in the emerging market developing economies, they have already increased the use of digital technologies. They have enhanced their diversification of suppliers and the production sites to increase their resilience to any sort of supply chain shocks. Now, the emerging markets of the developing economies should be able to offer a conducive business environment such as a skilled workforce and adequate infrastructure to snatch new opportunities to integrate into the global supply chains. Our next topic, that is, how is trade related to growth? Theoretical literature have extensively showed that there is a positive association between growth and trade. And this has also been not only confined in theoretical literature, but empirical literature also shows this. And also the empirical literature have also showed that it differs from country characteristics. Traditional trade theorists like David Ricardo and Finster in his 2003 work, explains how trade raises output levels. But very strangely, they are silent about the effects on the long-term output growth of trade. In contrast, if we look at more recent trade growth theorists, they describe a positive relationship between the two, but they also trace out the mechanisms through which trade lifts long-term productivity and output growth. These recent trade growth theorists are Helpman, Krugman, the newly Nobel laureate Lucas in his 1993 paper. Now, if we look at the channels by which trade and growth takes place, there are mainly three channels that needs to be explored. Number one, the access to foreign markets. Now, access to foreign markets allows countries to acquire new technologies, especially when trade occurs between different countries which had got different technological endowments. Secondly, if we look at openness to international trade, we find that it offers opportunities to exploit economies of scale and also the concept of learning by doing. This basically will enhance both productivity growth and the variety of goods that are produced and consumed in the economies of the world. Thirdly, we come to another very important point, that is, there is some sort of competitive pressure that arises from trade, and that helps or encourages innovation and factor reallocation, which includes the exit of the least productive firms, thus lifting the overall productivity of the economies. Now, if I try to explain these three channels, what do we see? Technological progress, by enhancing the productivity of labor and other factors of production, is really a critical driver in the long-term output growth and poverty reduction. The creation, application, and diffusion of technological advances and to generate positive externalities and increasing returns to scale. However, as technological innovation tends to occur only in a limited number of countries, international spillover is the key word, because it only helps to spread this technology worldwide. International trade, like foreign direct investment, is one of the primary channel of diffusion of new technology, as it makes available to importers processes and products that embody foreign knowledge and that would otherwise be unavailable, or it would be very costly, as has been proposed by famous trade theorists like Helpman, Grossman, and so on. Trade generally generates two types of externalities. Now, one is called pure knowledge spillover, and the other is called rent spillover. Pure knowledge spillover arises mostly through licensing agreements or through firms that are purely multinational in character. Rent spillovers occur when prices of the imported intermediate and capital goods do not fully reflect the costs of innovation embedded in them, so that part of the rents from innovation are transferred from the innovating firm to the trading partners. International trade allows countries to exploit these economies of scale and network effects in areas where they generally have a comparative advantage. Trade usually causes output to expand, and in the presence of increasing returns to scale, firms' fixed costs are spread over a large number of units produced, and this results in more efficient production at a smaller average cost. Through a similar mechanism, the output expansion that is associated with trade also allow greater product variations, and this also leads to enhanced productivity. In addition, innovations resulting from international trade often allows workers to acquire new human capital through the concept of learning by doing as workers take up new tasks. And this also again boosts productivity and helps the country to move up the product quality ladder. And again, this theory has been given to us by Lucas in his 1993 paper. So, by increasing competition, trade also promotes productivity growth by reallocating resources towards more efficient firms, as the least productive firms are encouraged to exit from the market. We should also keep this in mind that entering foreign markets, this imposes an upfront cost for the exporting firms. And only firms which are relatively productive, they can generally engage in exporting. Once they have entered a new market, exporting firms can expand and attract workers and capital, thus tending to force out firms which are limited to the domestic market because they are inferior in their efficiency. In addition, by raising competitive pressures in the domestic market, the international trade lowers the firm's markup over the marginal cost and encourages any sort of organizational change and production upgrades to boost any sort of productivity within the firm itself. And this has been shown by Melitz and Ottaviano in their 2008 paper. So if we try to analyze the recent trade growth and prospects, we find that the growth of global trade in goods and non-factor services was sharply weaker in the pre-pandemic decade. It was just around 3.8% a year during the period 2011 to 19. That is just the pre-pandemic decade. But if we look at the period much before that, that is from 1970 to 2008, we found that it averaged at around 5.8% a year. So with the exception of Europe and Central Asia, the slowdown in trade growth extended across all the emerging market developing economy regions. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, trade growth was particularly weak. It was around half the emerging market developing economies average over the 2010s. So this slowdown there was concentrated in goods trade. Service trade continued to outpace world output growth by around 1.5 percentage points a year on average during the period 2011 to 2019, before the pandemic hit the world. So there was also a decline in the global output elasticity of trade. What essentially do I mean by global output elasticity of trade? It means a trade increase that is associated with a 1% increase in output. And in the decade just before the pandemic, it declined from around 2.2% during 1990 to 2011, and just before the pandemic it was around 1%. That is 2011 to 19. So here, you cannot really blame the pandemic for this. This decline in global output elasticity of trade had been on the decline throughout these periods. at the changes in the composition of global demand, we find that the composition of global demand have shifted away from the advanced economies towards the emerging market developing economies and towards less trade-intensive components of aggregate demand. Now, the emerging market developing economies, they typically have a lower trade intensity than the advanced economies of the world. Investment, which tends to be more trade intensive than other components of demand, was weak over the past decade, especially in these emerging market economies. And this reflected a shift, a number of factors, including a policy-guided shift away from investment-led growth in China and the effects of prolonged weaknesses of the commodity prices on investment in the commodity exporters. Another very important point is the maturing of the global value chains. We know that over the past decade, the expansion of the global value chains have slowed down. The share of global value chain related trade in the total world trade grew significantly in the 90s and the early 2000s. But after that, it has started stagnating, or rather, if we look at the time period from 2011 onwards, we find that it has started declining also. This has in part reflected the rising labor costs in the key emerging market economies, a greater appreciation by firms of supply risks in the wake of natural disasters, and mounting trade tensions over the past few years. Now, trade in construction and in services, which tend not to be embedded in the deep global value chains, they have increased their share of global trade only after 2010. So we can say that the part that needs to be played by the global value chain has already done its part till 2010, and from 2011 onwards we are witnessing their decline. The next important point is trade tensions. A slowing pace of trade liberalization may have also been contributed to a lower trade elasticity. Tariff rates have leveled off in both the advanced economies and in the emerging market developing economies in the early 2000s. At the same time, there was increased use of regulatory measures and other non-tariff barriers such as export subsidies, restrictions on licenses or on foreign direct investment, and domestic clauses in public procurements. We now turn our attention to the pandemic-triggered collapse in world trade and its recovery. Now, the global recession that started from 2020 was the deepest since World War II, and we cannot negate this fact. This was also accompanied by a collapse in global trade in goods and non-factor services. So in 2020 as a whole, goods trade fell by around 7%, which is considerably more than in the average global recession since 1975. Now, unusual for global recessions, the collapse in the global services trade was larger than the collapse in the global goods trade. This generally doesn't take place. Global goods trade collapse takes place at a faster rate than the collapse in the service trade. But here, the opposite took place. The decline in service trade was considerably more pronounced, and the recovery was more subdued than in the past global recessions. And this partly reflects the collapse in global tourism as countries started to close off following the pandemic, the COVID, to stem the spread of the virus. And in 2020, services trade fell by around 20 percentage points, which is more than twice the average drop of around 8 percentage points in global recessions since the period 1975. The recovery in global trade since 2020, this partly reflected a rotation of global demand. So when we started to view the global recovery, we find the most important fact here was the global demand have rotated towards more trade-intensive manufactured goods, especially the durable goods, and away from services which tend to be non-tradable in nature. The increase in industrial production had almost mirrored this spurt in trade growth. And this is consistent with both being lifted by a common factor because there was a rebound in global demand just after the pandemic and after the economies and the countries opened. The recovery in goods trade had been fairly broad-based, with global imports of cars, capital goods, consumer goods, and industrial supplies all back at or above the pre-pandemic levels by January 2021. And this is being reported from the IMF reports of 2021. However, global goods stalled again in the second half of 2021 amid slowing demand growth and tightened supply bottlenecks. And I think the most important factor behind this was the February 2022's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which disrupted all trade flows from the Black Sea and especially curtailed all sort of trade in commodities. So through most of 2021, global services trade remained below the pre-pandemic levels in contrast with earlier global recessions where it typically recovered quite rapidly. This did not take place because just after, as I'm saying repeatedly, that just after the COVID pandemic, as soon as economies were starting to recover, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So aggregate service trade only reached pre-pandemic levels in September 2021, and by January 2022, most components of service trade, including telecommunications and financial services, had fully recovered to pre-pandemic levels, but travel services remained around 40% lower. So, when I talk about prospects for global trade growth, what we can see, and here we will fall back into the 2023 Global Economic Prospects Report. And in that report, they say that global trade growth is projected to slow under 4% in 2022 from more than 10% in 2021, and they have said that it's going to slow further in 2023. And this forecast reflects slower projected global output growth is slower, but also diminished trade intensity of global output. The structural factors that supported the rapid expansion of trade in the decade preceding the global financial crisis seem to have largely lost their force, so that the recently reduced elasticity of global trade with respect to global output seems likely to constitute the new normal at this point of time. And since global output growth itself is projected to be at around 0.4 percentage point slower in the forecast period, that is from 2022 to 2030, than in the previous decade, world trade growth is also expected to slow down. Since, as I have already pointed out in the initial part of this module, that world trade has some sort of relation with the world output growth. So thus, if we assume that the trade elasticity to output growth remains at around 1, as it was during the 2010s, and assuming that there has been no certain major policy change, trade growth over the remaining of the 2020s is likely to be slower by another 0.4 percentage point a year than in the preceding decade. And the weakness may be more pronounced in the growth of the goods trade. In goods trade, new technologies may allow more localized, more centralized production. And in service trade, rapidly growing data services promise a return to rapid expansion as the pandemic is slowly brought under control in most of the countries of the world. So, the 4 decades prior to the global financial crisis saw a steady increase in global economic integration through trade. And this has generally been assisted by a falling rate in the tariff rates. However, since the global financial crisis, trade integration had stalled with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which added further impediments to the process. With Russia's share of global oil production having increased considerably in the recent decades, there is now a material risk that the disruptions caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine could lead to a major reconfiguration of the world trade and investment network, as countries are now going to look for alternative sources of energy. While this may boost trade in some parts of the global economy, it is likely to disrupt trade elsewhere in the world, since such a reconfiguration would be motivated by political and security rather than economic consideration. It is likely to reduce global economic welfare as well as trade in the long run. So here we talk now about what we essentially mean by trading cost or trade cost. The fading momentum of global trade growth is diminishing its role as an engine of output and productivity growth, and countries really need to find new ways to reap these benefits from trade. And one possibility for the countries is to cut down the trading cost to boost exports and encourage imports in a manner that is itself growth enhancing. A number of studies have also documented the negative impact of trade cost on trade growth and boost the productivity that can resulting from lowering of these trade cost. So trade cost essentially has been recognized as an important factor in firms' decision to choose outsourcing over insourcing. Measures that can lower trade cost at the border includes trade facilitation through reform of customs and border procedures, tariff reductions and tariff agreements. Measures that lower trade costs between borders include improvements in transport, communications, energy infrastructure and service networks. Measures that reduce trade costs behind the borders include reforms of trade-related regulations and institutions, improvement in logistics and broader market governance, improvement in domestic transport infrastructure and in the market structure of domestic trucking and port operations, and the lowering of other non-tariff barriers. Beyond policies to facilitate trade, a wider set of institutional policies might also be needed to ensure that the benefits are sustainable and widely shared. Now, as we come to the conclusion and the policy recommendations, we find that despite a decline over the past 3 decades, we find that international trade costs are higher. In the emerging market developing economies, they amount to the equivalent of a tariff of more than 100%. Thus, they roughly double the price of an internationally traded good relative to a similarly domestically traded good. So, trade costs are on average about 4/5 higher for agricultural products than for the manufactured products, and more than 1/2 higher for the emerging market developing economies than for the advanced economies. And trade costs also have a number of components. Tariffs only amount to about 1/20th of the trade cost. The remaining are mostly costs of transport, logistics, and adherence to regulations, and thus they reflect market conditions in the transport sector, administrative practices, and non-tariff trade barriers. About 2/5 of the difference in trade cost between the emerging market developing economies and the advanced economies is accounted for by differences in the cost of logistics and shipping, and another 2/5 by differences in trade policies, including uncertainty in trade policy. Comprehensive package of reforms have often been successful in reducing the trading cost, and such packages can include trade facilitation measures, bilateral and multilateral agreements aimed at deeper trade integration, coordinated efforts to streamline trade procedures and processes at and behind the border, improved domestic infrastructure, increased competition in shipping and logistics, reduced corruption, simplified trade-related procedures and regulations, and the harmonization or mutual recognition of standard. Further, research and analysis on trade cost is warranted, particularly regarding patterns and the correlates of the service trade cost. Measures of service trade costs remain scant, which makes it difficult to assess and quantify their determinants. In addition, since trade costs in services are largely associated with regulatory barriers, further analysis of the role of regulatory heterogeneity across sectors and regions is extremely important and useful. So trade costs accumulate with multiple border crossings through the global value chain. Investigating what policy measures can be most effective in reducing the trade cost when countries are involved in complex value chain is extremely important. Finally, research should be aimed to better understand the distributional and climate-related impact of reducing the trading costs.